Okay, sounds good. All right. Well, I guess I want to preface this conversation by pointing out that overall, I post against the claims of Rome. I post against the claims of the Catholic Church quite a bit, but we have to acknowledge that around this time between the 1500s and the 1700s, when like these Messianic, then secular Jewish movements that really changed the way that Judaism worked, was corresponding with actually a time of anti-clericalism. And we point to the usual candidates like the Jesuits and all this, and the Vatican being involved with the Jewish conspiracies and stuff. And I bring this up because we see large trends where you have the whole anti-clericalist trends come into the Jewish communities for social engineering purposes too. But I want to point out though that you actually have the same thing going on in the Catholic Church, where the same people who are actually running those institutions, the same behind the scenes power players in those locations, are pushing the exact same kind of things in there. So I want to point that out though, because a lot of people will end up spinning narratives where it's like, oh, hey, look, you have the Catholics, they're really behind everything, and they're on the side of Catholicism, where I think that's a little bit of a category error, and that same kind of category error is what's behind the Jewish question. So this is where it starts tying in. Like I'd argue what you're actually fundamentally looking at is you're looking at Hermeticism, Gnosticism, and that's ultimately what went into Kabbalism. It's like this esoteric Kabbalism that these power cults use. It's a mishmash of a bunch of different things, and you can even argue that it ends up going back to ancient Egypt. So it's like you have the whole tree of life schema. It's not the exact same as where you have the Hebrew characters and you have like a Jewish folklore associated with it, and you have like Jewish otherworldly realms. It's like that those innovations on Kabbalah are new, but Hermeticism, it goes back to Egypt. Plato talks about it, and the Timaeus talks about getting some kind of esoteric knowledge from there, right? Same thing with much of the metaphysics and schema for the Kabbalah. So where that comes in is,
I think there was also oh, sorry.
So I'm just saying where that comes in is, so we were talking about these Jewish Messianic movements that ended up going to occultic circles. So Sabbateanism, we got into a little bit more of the history of Sabbateanism last week. There wasn't, it's like, obviously you did have secret societies and occultism involved with that, but its doctrine was less on the surface, completely esoteric than I'd say Jacob Frank was. So Jacob Frank was in these currents, and he started off with these like Sabbatean, Messianic, Jewish kind of claims, but he actually took it a good step further than that. He actually took it in a anti-clerical, atheistic kind of perspective while still claiming Jewish messianism, and that ends up confusing a lot of people. But if you understand that the fundamental operating system for this, rather they're using a Jewish shell rather than using a Catholic shell, they're ultimately subverting the old order, and they're one single hermetic cult. So it's like they end up actually pushing what you can call anti-clericalism, atheism, and nihilism. And yeah, you see this with Jacob Frank. So Jacob Frank, he was in Poland actually. So when he's actually started getting into these occultic circles, he was actually being sponsored by nobles and pretty much going over to their houses. So yeah, you might want to pick up there, but I just want to point out those dynamics.
Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with, because I do believe, in what we would call now the Counter-Reformation. And the only way, and I think that part of what the Counter-Reformation was about was, well, if we can't, stop people from reading the Bible, then we can just completely debunk the Bible through science, through scientism, and through creating science and breaking the yoke of any kind of religious leadership. And for the Jewish community, especially if there was a pre-planned intention, which was probably had already been thought of, because the Puritans were technically early Zionists who believed in resettling the land of Israel. I think the only way that a Zionist movement would have been able to come about was with the breaking of the rabbinic authorities, because Jews, if they were forced to continue living in shtetls and speaking Yiddish and following, then there would have never been, and they would have never entered the age of the national identity with with a desire to have their own national identity separate from being German, Polish, or whatever they were. So I think that was a big part of what the Frankists, because they wanted people to have a certain, like the occult. They wanted them to practice mysticism, and this was not just in the Jewish world. This was across the Jewish world. Was actually turning it inward on itself, because the Sabbatean movement had basically thrown Kabbalah into mainstream, and Jews were basically liberated, like some semi-liberated, to the point where if they converted, or they could just leave the ghetto and practice Kabbalah or do whatever they wanted without the yoke of rabbinic authority. The rabbis then turned it more insular, and because Kabbalah was a lot bigger among the Spanish Jews, amongst the Sephardic Jews, than it was amongst the Eastern European. It became popular.
Well, that's where it came from. Yeah, that's where it came from. Yeah, contrary to the Khazarian mafia guys, they make it sound like it came from the steppe, but no, it actually came from Leon, Spain, and Valencia, Spain. Yeah, probably some other places there, but those are two big ones.
I think it originates. So I think that that Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, does actually originate in the Babylonian exile, and I believe that because part of what the rabbis do, and how because Judaism's always in flux, because it changes with the time, and I think that when the Jews had gone to Babylon, they had encountered what I call household mysticism, which is what Kabbalah is a part of. They had encountered regular use of it. So in order to basically in order to have the best, to have their cake and eat it too, to stop people from just going all out, because it could lead to, blood stuff. Like stuff that's outside of what would be the Jewish legal parameters. They created Kabbalah, and Kabbalah is basically occultism or mysticism within the framework of Jewish law. So that's where I think it originated from, and I think it mostly
I agree. Yeah,
and I think it's stuck for the most part with the upper echelon of the Jewish society. I don't think it was common among regular people. It was more common. You had to be fully knowledgeable on the law, on the Torah, on the Talmud, in order to actually begin a process of learning Kabbalah. And that actually, at one point, the rabbis changed it to the age of 40. They said you could not start practicing. And this was, I think, around the Sabbatean era. They were saying, no, until you're 40 years old and fully astute on everything else, you cannot even start studying it, because they didn't want Judaism to center around it. Judaism is supposed to center around the law, and Kabbalah is like, all right, you've read the Talmud, you've gone through it, you've studied it, you're an expert, you're a Jewish legal expert. Now you can move on to something a little more, because now you have a full grasp understanding of the Jewish law, so you know what you should and shouldn't do.
Yeah, well, what I was getting at though is I agree with you on the Babylonian origins, but I'd say it got a little bit more feedback over in Spain from Silk Road channels, where you had more of a synthesis with other kinds of beliefs, because it does change a little bit over time. And I'd argue even the time of the Enlightenment, Renaissance era, you end up getting more facelifts from like the Medici revival of Hermeticism, and obviously like the Spinoza Enlightenment stuff. But yeah, it definitely is more or less within the upper echelons. I mean, that's why I brought up with Jacob Frank. What's interesting is he was actually studying these were more with lesser nobles. So greater nobles, or people who are like firstborn sons and heirs, obviously a lot of them end up being occultists. A lot of them end up being in these esoteric traditions. But it's pretty interesting. Like, the Grand Masters for the Teutonic Knights, two examples I give, who are part of the founders of the Bavarian Illuminati behind the scenes, actually, because, Colmer, who initiated Adam Weishaupt, he was actually Charles Lorraine. He was like a younger brother to the guy that married Marie Theresa, who was the Holy Roman Empress. So he was like the non-heir to the guy who became Holy Roman Emperor, and he was like the top Teutonic Knight, top of what became the Bavarian Illuminati. Then Maximilian Habsburg, who was like he had two brothers who became Holy Roman Emperors. He became the Grand Master of German Teutonic Knights also, and they have all kinds of occultic connections, and that's the same thing that was going on with Jacob Frank. So a lot of times this does end up being concentrated in the hands of the elites. A lot of them have a lot of time on their hands, and it ends up going to the lesser nobility because it's like, hey, you don't have as many official duties, so what are you going to do? And a lot of times those guys actually end up being like informally more powerful than, their straight up heirs too.
Sure. And there was also, and I would imagine also, just to say, because you mentioned about also with Spain, and there was a lot of Sufis, and there was a lot of Sufism, which is basically Islamic occultism, and I believe that they would have come into contact with that too, and that would have also contributed to the development of what we would, I guess, call nowadays Luric Kabbalah, which is, I think, the standard practice in this day and age, because it really hadn't been standardized for a while because it wasn't that widespread except in the Sephardic world. I think after Shabbatai Tzvi, it then enters in more, and as the Jews of Spain begin to disperse from the Iberian Peninsula and settle all over the place, including in Eastern and Central Europe, it begins to spread amongst them. And yes, that's when it becomes, and also in Tzfat, we have the city of Tzfat, which becomes a center for it.